In early 1968, a Soviet submarine, K-129, slipped away from its base on the Kamchatka Peninsula. It was a diesel-electric ballistic missile boat, heading out for a routine patrol in the vast emptiness of the North Pacific. There was nothing remarkable about its departure. It was just another day in the Cold War. But fatigue was a quiet stowaway aboard the vessel. The crew had been rushed back to sea with little rest after their last patrol. Some reports even suggest that sailors were borrowed from other boats just to fill the roster. Still, the mission went on. The hatches were sealed, the lines were cast off, and the submarine pointed its nose south, disappearing into the deep, cold water. On board, it carried a deadly cargo: nuclear missiles, nuclear torpedoes, and the immense weight of Cold War expectations. K-129 wasn't supposed to be seen or heard from for weeks. Like most Soviet submarines of its era, it was designed for stealth. Its job was to vanish, to run dark, silent, and completely alone. Radio silence was absolute, as any transmission could betray its position to an enemy listener. Once it submerged, it became a moving void, a ghost in the machine of the ocean. Its existence was known only to the men on board and a handful of commanders back home who were tracking its scheduled patrol route. The enormous Pacific Ocean swallowed it whole. Somewhere beyond the remote Aleutian Islands, beneath the rolling grey seas and bleak winter skies, K-129 descended to its patrol depth. The quiet, monotonous routines of submerged life began. Machinery checks, navigational fixes, whispered conversations in the narrow corridors, and long hours of listening to the endless hum of the ocean. Then, the silence changed. On March 8, 1968, K-129 missed a scheduled radio check-in. At first, this wasn't a major cause for alarm. Submarines sometimes missed communication windows for perfectly mundane reasons. But as the hours stretched into days, a sense of unease in Soviet Naval Command hardened into genuine alarm. Quietly, without admitting how serious the situation might be, search procedures were initiated. Soviet aircraft fanned out from bases in the Far East, their crews scanning the endless expanse of water below. Surface ships were dispatched to comb the designated patrol corridors. On board these ships, sonar operators strained their ears, listening for any hint of metal, any unnatural sound where the ocean usually spoke only in static and currents. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing. The Pacific is merciless in its sheer scale. A submarine the length of a football field can vanish within it as completely as a coin dropped into a deep river. The search grids were impossibly vast, drawn more out of hope than any real evidence. The searchers burned through fuel, and the crews scanned horizon after empty horizon. But beneath them, thousands of meters down, whatever had happened to K-129 had already concluded. The steel hull had either held against the immense pressure, or it had not. The air inside had either remained breathable, or it had been crushed out of existence in an instant. The Soviet search effort continued for weeks, which then bled into months. The intensity gradually faded as the grim reality settled in. A submarine that doesn't surface is almost never found by its own navy. Back in the port city of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, the families of the crew were given no clear answers. Officially, nothing was wrong. Unofficially, doors were closed, and conversations about the missing boat and its crew simply stopped. The Cold War was a machine that demanded secrecy, even in grief. Eventually, K-129 was declared lost with all hands. 98 men simply ceased to exist in the public record. Their fate was sealed away behind the dense, opaque language of classified documents and unmarked files. The ocean kept its silence, and the Soviet Union moved on, at least outwardly unchanged by the loss. But the sea had spoken, just not to Moscow. Unbeknownst to the Soviets, the underwater world was being listened to, constantly, by another global power. Across the entire Pacific Basin, the United States Navy maintained a sprawling, secret network of hydrophones called SOSUS. These arrays of underwater microphones were laid across strategic choke points and deep-water submarine routes. They were finely tuned to detect the unique acoustic signatures of submarines, the rhythmic beat of their propellers, the low thrum of their turbines, and, most importantly, the unnatural violence of an underwater explosion. In early March 1968, as Soviet ships were just beginning their desperate search, American analysts reviewing the data from these listening posts noticed something unusual. It was a sharp, brief acoustic event originating from the North Pacific. It didn't match the signature of an earthquake or any known naval exercises. It was the sound of something breaking, and breaking badly. The signal was faint, distorted by the immense distance and the complex oceanography of the deep sea, but its characteristics strongly suggested a sudden, catastrophic event, either an implosion or an explosion at great depth. The analysts replayed the recording over and over, adjusting filters, running it through computers, and comparing it against vast libraries of known underwater sounds. Slowly, a consensus began to form. They were listening to the death of a submarine. By triangulating the signal from multiple listening posts, they could even infer its approximate position. It wasn't a pinpoint location, but it was a starting point, calculated through complex mathematics, wave propagation models, and a healthy dose of educated guesswork. What the Americans didn't know, at least not at first, was whose submarine it was. In 1968, the Pacific was crowded with the steel ghosts of multiple navies, but as the weeks went on, the disappearance of K-129 became impossible to ignore. The frantic patterns of the Soviet search fleet, visible even from satellite and aerial reconnaissance, hinted at a major distress situation. Intelligence reports started to align with the acoustic data. Somewhere in the cold, northern reaches of the Pacific Ocean, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine now lay dead on the seabed. For American intelligence, this realization was a potent mix of dread and opportunity. A lost submarine is always a tragedy for the sailors and their families, but in the ruthless calculus of the Cold War, it was also a treasure trove of secrets. K-129 carried not just nuclear weapons, but also cryptographic systems, codebooks, and advanced hardware that could reveal exactly how Soviet submarines navigated, communicated, and fought. This kind of intelligence was priceless. There was just one enormous problem. The location indicated by the acoustic data placed the wreck under more than 16,000 feet of water, that's over 3 miles straight down. This was far, far deeper than any salvage operation ever attempted. The ocean floor there is a place of absolute cold, crushing pressure, and eternal darkness. It's a hostile environment where pressure alone can pulverize unprotected steel as if it were an aluminum can. At the time, raising anything from that depth was considered pure science fiction. Still, the data was logged, the analysis was refined, and the information was quietly escalated through the most secret channels of the US government. No public announcements were made. No flags were raised. The disappearance of K-129 remained, officially, a Soviet Matara tragedy, mourned in silence and obscured by military doctrine. But in secure rooms thousands of miles away, analysts were pinning charts to walls and marking them with circles that represented not a certainty, but a probability. The submarine had vanished, but its echo lingered, frozen on magnetic tape and in the memory of a handful of intelligence officers. Meanwhile, the wreck of K-129 rested in pieces on the ocean floor. Was it a devastating internal explosion, a catastrophic battery fire, a missile malfunction that went horribly wrong, or a cascade of smaller mechanical failures that doomed the ship? We don't know. All we know is that its final descent would have been terrifying and violent. As the hull breached and succumbed to the sea, pressure compartments would have imploded one by one, generating powerful shockwaves that rippled outward through the water, the very same shockwaves that were picked up by the listening arrays of another nation. When it finally came to rest, K-129 was a broken shell, partially buried in the deep-sea sediment. Its nuclear missiles were silent. Its crew of 98 men were entombed in a place where no sunlight had ever reached. Time passed. The seasons changed above the waves. The Cold War rolled on with new crises and new near misses. Publicly, K-129 became a forgotten footnote, just another unfortunate loss in a very dangerous profession. But privately, it became something else entirely. It was a fixed point on the ocean floor, a giant question mark waiting for an answer, and the catalyst for one of the most audacious, expensive, and secretive intelligence operations in history. The submarine had vanished beneath the Pacific, but its story was only just beginning to surface. It all started with a sound, a single, violent noise recorded by secret underwater microphones in the North Pacific in March of 1968 for American intelligence analysts. This wasn't a clear signal, but a whisper from the abyss. They didn't have a location, just a hypothesis, a massive oval drawn on a map, spanning thousands of square miles of ocean. It was a ghost geometry, a puzzle defined by the time delays between hydrophones scattered across the ocean floor. The ocean itself was the biggest problem. It isn't just empty space, it's a massive, living lens. It bends, scatters, and weakens sound. To turn that single sharp noise into an actual place on a map required immense patience, complex math, and the humility to be wrong, over and over again. Inside secure rooms, a unique team was assembled. This wasn't just a job for sailors. Naval intelligence experts worked alongside civilian physicists, statisticians, and oceanographers, people who understood the strange physics of the deep, how pressure, salt, and temperature could refract a sound wave across an entire ocean basin. And among them were analysts from the CIA. Their interests went far beyond just finding some wreckage. If a Soviet ballistic missile submarine had gone down, and if it was even partially intact, it represented an intelligence jackpot, a prize bigger than almost anything seen since the dawn of the nuclear age. The sound itself had come from a top-secret network known as SOSUS. This network of underwater listening posts was built in the 1950s with one purpose: to track Soviet submarines moving through critical choke points. It was never designed to pinpoint a wreck on the abyssal plain, 3 miles down. But the signal from March 1968 was different. It was loud, clear, and demanded attention. Analysts frantically compared it to their libraries of known sounds: undersea mining explosions, geological events, even other implosions. They quickly ruled out earthquakes. Earthquakes have a distinct signature that lasts longer, with complex aftershocks. This sound was brutally abrupt, a single, violent punctuation mark in the otherwise endless, quiet hum of the ocean. Slowly, painstakingly, the giant oval on the map began to shrink. Every small refinement came from arguing with the data, testing new theories. What if the implosion happened deeper? What if it was closer to the surface? You'd see reflections in the waveform. Models were built, adjusted, thrown out, and rebuilt from scratch. Days bled into weeks as the probability maps were redrawn again and again. By the end of 1968, the search area had narrowed significantly. It was still enormous, roughly the size of a small state, but it was no longer an impossible, absurdly large patch of ocean. Still, you couldn't just send a ship out to search an area that big. The real breakthrough didn't come from a sound, but from an absence. American intelligence began watching the Soviet Navy with obsessive intensity. They tracked surface ships, air patrols, and search operations. The Soviets were clearly looking for something, somewhere specific, and while they never announced they found it, their relentless search pattern suggested they were confident their lost submarine was within a definable zone. When the analysts overlaid the maps of Soviet search activity with their own acoustic probability maps, it was like two translucent sheets clicking into alignment. The search area shrank again, dramatically. How do you actually see the ocean floor, miles below the surface? To do that, the United States turned to a machine that existed at the very edge of what was technologically possible: a submarine built for deep-sea photographic reconnaissance. The vessel chosen for this impossible mission was the USS Halibut. Originally designed as a missile submarine, it had been repurposed for undersea intelligence work. Its very existence was a symbol of the era weapon of war converted into a tool for quiet, meticulous observation. Where nuclear missiles once sat, engineers had installed a suite of advanced cameras, powerful lights, and an array of sensors, all capable of operating in the crushing pressure miles below the waves. In 1969, the Halibut sailed into the North Pacific. Its mission was cloaked under so many layers of classification that even many of the sailors on board had no idea what they were truly looking for. The official story was oceanographic research. The reality was a high-stakes hunt for a tomb of steel. The work was brutal in its monotony. The Halibut crept along, just a few hundred feet above the seabed, dragging a sled packed with cameras behind it. It was like mowing a massive, dark, silent lawn. They photographed strip after strip of seemingly featureless mud. Each pass captured thousands of images, dark, grainy frames, illuminated for a split second by artificial light. Most of them revealed nothing but mud, rocks, and the occasional bizarre deep-sea creature, startled into motion by the sudden intrusion. Days blended into one another. Film was developed right there on the submarine and examined, frame by painstaking frame. The vast majority of the photos were worthless, but they couldn't know which one might hold the key until it was already behind them. Navigation at these depths was an art, relying on inertial systems and dead reckoning. It was imperfect. A tiny mistake, a deviation of just a few degrees, could mean missing the wreck entirely and sailing right past it without ever knowing. And then, it happened. The monotonous, muddy seabed changed. One frame showed something angular, a straight line where no straight line should exist in nature. The next frame revealed twisted metal, half buried in the sediment. Soon there was no doubt. The cameras had found it. A field of debris appeared, then larger sections of a hull, and finally, the unmistakable, tragic shape of a submarine torn to pieces. The bow lay separated from the rest of the vessel. Its pressure hull was violently ruptured. The missile tubes were crushed like empty soda cans. The damage told a story of sudden, catastrophic violence. The K-129 hadn't just settled peacefully on the bottom. It had been destroyed on its way down. On board the halibut, the emotional impact of the discovery was carefully contained. This wasn't a moment for celebration. The images showed personal effects scattered among the wreckage, haunting evidence of the men who had lived and died there. But for the intelligence officials back in Washington, the implications were staggering. Here, resting in the near-freezing darkness, was Soviet nuclear technology. It was untouched, preserved. The same incredible depth that had killed the crew had also protected their secrets from the world. The photographs were flown back to the United States and shown to only a tiny handful of top decision-makers. What they saw in those grainy images forced a question that had, until that moment, seemed like pure science fiction. Could they recover any of it? Not just inspect it from a distance, not just take samples, but physically lift it from the ocean floor, 3 miles down. Conventional wisdom screamed no. The depth alone was beyond the reach of any existing salvage technology. The wreck's condition made it even worse. The K-129 was fractured, unstable, resting in soft sediment that could easily swallow any heavy lifting equipment. Any attempt to grab it risked tearing it apart completely, destroying the very intelligence they hoped to gain. And then there was the political firestorm. If the Soviets detected a recovery attempt, the Cold War could heat up very, very quickly. This wasn't some neutral scientific exercise. It was a potential act of espionage on an unprecedented, almost unbelievable scale. But those photographs had changed everything. The mission had transformed a Cold War mystery into a logistical, technological, and moral dilemma. The submarine was no longer just a ghost on a map. It was a tangible object, with visible, identifiable components. Analysts began cataloging what might still be intact: missile sections, guidance systems, codebooks, cryptographic gear, maybe even parts of the command center. Each item represented a priceless insight into Soviet military doctrine and capabilities. The search for K-129 had done more than just locate a wreck. The ocean floor no longer held an abstract secret, held something real, something reachable. If only someone was audacious enough to try and grab it. How do you lift a 2,000-ton Soviet submarine from 3 miles beneath the ocean's surface in the late 1960s? This wasn't just a hypothetical question. It was a top-secret challenge facing the highest levels of the US government. After the wreck of the K-129 was located, imagination became the only limit. Engineers and intelligence officers found themselves in uncharted territory. No manual or precedent existed for such a task. Oil rigs reached deep water, sure, but they were built to pull up liquid, not thousands of tons of fractured steel. Standard salvage ships, useless. Their cables would snap, and divers would be instantly crushed by the immense pressure. If K-129 was to be raised, it would require something entirely new. The problem quickly moved up the chain of command, landing in the hands of a special group within the CIA. Their job wasn't to ask if it was easy or cheap. It was neither, but to determine if it was even possible. For months, ideas were sketched out and thrown away. Giant claws on cables that would break under their own weight, encasing the wreck in synthetic foam. Most concepts just didn't hold up under scrutiny. But one idea, as wild as it sounded, started to gain traction. The plan was to build an entirely new ship, a vessel designed for one single, audacious purpose: to retrieve a submarine from the abyss. And the mission had to be disguised so perfectly that not even Soviet intelligence would suspect a thing. This wasn't just an engineering problem, it was a deception campaign on a global scale. To pull off a lie this big, the CIA needed a convincing public face, someone whose reputation was already larger than life. By the early 1970s, Hughes was a legend, a billionaire aviation pioneer, a film producer, and an eccentric recluse. His companies were known for pursuing projects that bordered on science fiction. If anyone could plausibly build a massive, experimental ship for a strange reason, it was him. Through a web of intermediaries and shell corporations, Hughes' name was attached to a project supposedly focused on deep-sea mining. The official story was that this new ship would harvest manganese nodules from the ocean floor. It was a brilliant cover. The concept was scientifically plausible, and a ship designed for deep-sea mining would need exactly the kind of equipment the CIA secretly required: deep-reaching tools, incredible stability, and advanced handling systems. And so, the Hughes Glomar Explorer was born. Construction began quietly, but a ship this enormous couldn't be completely hidden. It was longer than a football field, with a massive opening in the center of its hull called a moon pool. This giant hole, concealed by huge doors, would allow the salvage equipment to be lowered and raised completely hidden from outside view. From the water, it looked like an industrial oddity. On the inside, it was a floating factory straight out of a spy movie. At the heart of the ship was the revolutionary lifting system. Instead of flimsy cables, engineers designed a rigid pipe string, similar to what's used in offshore drilling. Section by section, this massive steel pipe would be lowered to the seabed, creating a solid column strong enough to bear the immense weight of the submarine. At the end of the pipe was the capture device, a giant mechanical claw nicknamed Clementine, designed to slide under the sub and grip it securely. Every single part of this machine pushed the boundaries of technology. The pipe sections had to align with millimeter precision, even as the ship was being tossed by ocean swells. The ship itself needed to stay perfectly still over the target for weeks on end. This led to the development of early dynamic positioning systems, computer-controlled thrusters that could hold the massive vessel almost motionless against wind, waves, and currents. Secrecy was absolute. Workers were only told what they needed to know for their specific job. Entire sections of the ship were built behind physical walls, inaccessible to most of the crew. For many involved, the true mission was something they could only guess at. In the thick of the Cold War, it was often safer not to know. Meanwhile, the planners obsessed over everything that could go wrong. What if the Soviets spotted them? What if a satellite snapped a picture? What if a Soviet ship sailed right up to them? The cover story had to be airtight. The Glomar Explorer was outfitted with equipment you'd expect to see on a mining vessel. Fake scientific papers were written. Press releases were drafted. The fiction had to be bulletproof. But there was one terrifying question nobody could answer. What was the condition of the wreck? The initial photos showed a submarine that was already broken. The sheer force of trying to lift it could cause the fragile hull to completely disintegrate. Engineers ran simulations. They built scale models, but the results were inconclusive. Some scenarios ended in success. Others predicted catastrophic failure. Still, the project moved forward. By the early 1970s, the Glomar Explorer was launched and outfitted. Its true purpose known only to a tiny handful of people at the very top. To the world, it was just Howard Hughes' latest bizarre project. To those in the know, it was the biggest gamble of the Cold War. As the ship prepared to sail, another question arose, the human one. If they recovered the remains of the Soviet sailors, how should they be handled? What were their obligations to the dead of an enemy nation? These were heavy ethical questions discussed in quiet rooms, with no easy answers. The mission was about intelligence, but everyone knew they were about to disturb a final resting place. When the Hughes Glomar Explorer finally set course for the North Pacific, it carried more than just advanced machinery. It carried years of secrets, calculations, and the belief that human ingenuity could overcome both nature and geopolitics. 3 miles below its hull, a shattered submarine waited. The stage was set for one of the most daring covert operations in history. All that was left was to try and lift the In the summer of 1974, a ship unlike any other sat motionless in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This was the Glomar Explorer. To any passing vessel, it looked like an experimental deep-sea mining ship, engaged in a slow, tedious task. That was the cover story, and it was perfect. The ship had no anchors, yet it stayed perfectly still, thousands of meters above a specific, invisible point on the abyssal plain. Its thrusters, guided by advanced computers, made constant, minute adjustments, fighting the wind, the currents, and the swell. On the surface, everything was calm. But deep below deck, one of the most audacious and secretive operations in history was underway. Through a giant opening in the ship's hull, known as a moon pool, a massive steel pipe was being assembled, section by section, and lowered into the crushing darkness of the deep ocean. Each segment locked into the next, forming a rigid steel spine that would eventually stretch for miles. The work was agonizingly slow. Crews worked around the clock, surrounded by the constant hum and thud of machinery performing an unprecedented feat. A single mistake, a tiny crack, a misaligned thread could doom the entire multi-billion-dollar mission. For weeks, the pipe string descended deeper and deeper, until finally, the instruments confirmed it. They had reached the seabed. Cameras switched on, piercing the absolute blackness with artificial light. The wreckage of the Soviet submarine K-129, unseen since it sank in 1968. The submarine was broken. Its bow was partially intact, but its midsection was a field of crushed, scattered debris. The engineers knew they couldn't lift the whole thing. The plan had always been to recover the forward section, where they believed the missile launch controls, codebooks, and nuclear warheads were located. Now, the most critical phase began. The capture vehicle, a colossal mechanical claw, nicknamed Clementine, was deployed. It descended the final few meters and unfolded like a giant metallic insect, its powerful arms designed to slide under the submarine wreck and cradle it from below. This was the moment of truth. If the arms didn't seat correctly, if the seafloor sediment shifted, if the fractured hull of the submarine crumbled under the strain, it was all over. There were no second chances. There were no divers who could go down to fix a problem. The entire operation was being run remotely, guided by grainy video feeds and a profound trust in calculations made years before. In the control rooms aboard the Glomar Explorer, a tense silence fell. Engineers watched as the indicators showed the arms closing around the wreck. The load readings stabilized. Weight was being transferred. It was working. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the lift began. The miles-long pipe string took on the immense strain, bending slightly but holding firm. The wreck of K-129 rose from the seabed for the first time in 6 years, shedding clouds of mud that bloomed like ghostly smoke. As the submarine section ascended, the physics of its environment changed dramatically. Metal that had rested under immense compression was now under tension. The vibrations of the lift introduced new stresses. Suddenly, small failures began to appear on the sensor readings. The load was becoming uneven. The engineers slowed the ascent, hoping to let the stresses equalize, but it was too late. Something gave way. Whether from metal fatigue or a structural failure in the wreck itself, a huge portion of the submarine section tore free. It tumbled back into the abyss, disappearing from the camera's view in seconds, lost forever. The loss sent a shockwave through the control room. It wasn't panic, but a stunned, silent recalibration of reality. But the operation wasn't over. They faced a grim choice: continue the ascent and risk losing everything, or cut it loose to preserve the mission's secrecy, forfeiting years of work and billions of dollars. They chose to continue. The lift resumed, even slower this time. Each meter gained an exercise in pure restraint. As the wreckage rose, seawater began to drain from compartments that had been sealed since the sinking, and with the water came a somber discovery. Inside the wreckage were the remains of Soviet sailors, men who had died in an instant, or perhaps slowly, trapped in the dark. Their final moments were unknowable, but their presence was undeniable. This had never been just a technical mission to recover hardware. Now, the human cost was no longer an abstract concept. When the recovered section finally breached the surface and entered the hidden moon pool, it was completely concealed from the outside world. The giant doors on the ship's bottom closed. To any observer, the Glomar Explorer was still just a mining vessel, quietly going about its business. Inside, the reality was stark. The wreckage they brought up contained invaluable intelligence, but it wasn't everything they had hoped for. The missile components were incomplete. The cryptographic systems were either missing or damaged beyond recovery. The most valuable secrets had been in the section that broke away and fell back to the ocean floor. The mission was a partial success and a partial failure. It was a technological miracle that delivered less than it promised. But there was another, more solemn task to perform. 6 sets of human remains had been recovered. These were Soviet sailors, preserved by the cold and the dark, now brought into the light. The CIA, the very agency that saw them as the enemy, made a quiet, deliberate decision. These men would be given a burial at sea, with full military honors. A ceremony was held on the deck of the Glomar Explorer. For a brief moment, on a secret spy ship in the middle of the ocean, the Cold War was set aside in a shared, human understanding of the sea and the price it demands. All of this happened in total secrecy. The Glomar Explorer finished its mission, packed up its equipment, and sailed away, leaving the ocean to its silence. Back in Washington, the debates began. Was Project Azorian a success or a failure? Some hailed it as a triumph of engineering, proof that America could reach anywhere on the planet. Others saw it as an expensive gamble with incomplete returns. In reality, both were right. The story of the Glomar Explorer is a testament to human ingenuity and the incredible lengths nations will go to in the name of security. It succeeded and failed at the same time, leaving behind fragments of truth and a profound sense of what can never be fully recovered from the deep. It was a secret broken, and a secret kept, all at once. The ocean had given up part of its prize, only to swallow the rest whole once again, forever. What was brought back from the depths of the Pacific never really entered the public consciousness. The recovered section of the Soviet submarine K-129 was secretly disassembled, examined, and then buried in a classification system designed to erase its own existence. Reports circulated under code names, and assessments were carefully hedged. Some analysts emphasized the wins, confirmation of Soviet missile designs, insights into their metallurgy, and a real look at how their industry performed under extreme pressure. Others focused on what was lost: intact warheads, complete guidance systems, and cryptographic materials that could have unlocked years of intercepted messages. The truth, like the submarine itself, was fragmented and lay somewhere in the middle. Within the intelligence community, the operation wasn't seen as a total failure or a clean success. It was something rarer and more uncomfortable, a stunning demonstration of capability that could never be publicly acknowledged. The CIA had proven it could pull off an operation of unbelievable technical complexity right under the nose of a rival superpower. But this proof couldn't be used in public debates or to deter enemies. Its real value was the quiet confidence it gave to those in the know. For everyone else, the world remained oblivious. That illusion of ignorance shattered in 1975, not through spies or satellites, but through journalism. The story started to leak after a break-in at Howard Hughes' company office revealed documents hinting that his ship, the Glomar Explorer, wasn't built for deep-sea mining after all. Reporters smelled the story. They started asking questions, pressing officials to confirm or deny the ship's true mission. The government's response was something entirely new. A flat-out denial was unbelievable, but a confirmation was unthinkable. So, their lawyers came up with a phrase that did neither. When asked if the United States had tried to recover a Soviet submarine, officials stated that they could neither confirm nor deny the operation. This phrase, now famous as the Glomar response, became a legal artifact, a testament to an era where state secrets had to coexist with a free press. It was an admission that acknowledged the question without answering it, setting a precedent that still echoes in intelligence law today. For the Soviet Union, the public reaction was surprisingly muted. Officially, when the story hit international headlines, Moscow expressed outrage, accusing the US of desecrating a military grave. There's no clear evidence that Soviet leadership knew about the recovery while it was happening. If they suspected something, they chose not to intervene. Whether it was ignorance, miscalculation, or deliberate restraint, the chance for a direct confrontation passed without incident. For the families of the lost sailors, there was no closure. Not then. They were only told that their husbands and sons were lost at sea, serving their country. The details remained classified. They didn't even know that the Americans had held a burial at sea for their fallen crewmen. Decades would pass before bits of the story emerged from declassified files, allowing some families to belatedly understand where and how their loved ones had been found. The human cost of this operation lingered long after the machinery was taken apart. Technologically, the legacy of Project Azorian rippled out in unexpected ways. The dynamic positioning systems developed to keep the massive Glomar Explorer perfectly still over a target 3 miles deep went on to influence offshore oil drilling and deep-sea research. The advanced pipe handling techniques used to lift the wreckage found new applications in heavy industry. Lessons learned about metal fatigue, remote sensing, and deep-ocean operations quietly informed countless future engineering projects. In a way, K-129 changed the world not by what it revealed about Soviet weapons, but by what it forced American engineers to invent. And yet, the central mystery was never solved. Why did K-129 sink in the first place? The wreckage offered clues, but no definitive answer. Some evidence pointed to an internal explosion, maybe from volatile missile fuel or a battery failure. Other theories suggested a launch accident during a missile test, or a chain of mechanical failures made worse by a tired crew and a rushed deployment. More speculative ideas, like a collision with another submarine, have circulated for years but lack any solid proof. The part of the wreck that might hold the answer still lies where it fell, scattered across the seabed, untouched since 1974. The ocean, once again, kept its secrets. As years turned into decades, the Cold War that fueled this high-stakes mission faded into history. The Soviet Union dissolved. Archives opened up, but only selectively, revealing fragments and contradictions. Former officials shared their stories in memoirs and interviews, filling in some gaps while creating new ones. The Glomar Explorer itself was sold and repurposed, its strange origin story becoming more of a historical anecdote than a top state secret. What was once one of the most closely guarded operations in American intelligence slowly drifted into the gray zone between history and legend. But still, something about the K-129 story resists a final conclusion. Part of that is the nature of the mission itself. It was an act of incredible ambition carried out in total secrecy, touching on deep questions of sovereignty, ethics, and the limits of a nation's power. Was it a salvage mission or an act of espionage, a recovery effort or simple grave robbing? The answers really depend on your perspective and what you value most: national security, human dignity, or the unwritten rules of conduct between enemies. Another part of the enduring mystery lies in what was left behind. Somewhere on the floor of the North Pacific, beyond the reach of sunlight, the rest of K-129 still rests. Its missiles are inert now, its hull slowly giving way to corrosion, its compartments now home to creatures adapted to eternal darkness. It's a war grave that belongs to no single nation, marked by no monument, and visited by no one. The coordinates are known to a select few, but forgotten by most. In that sense, the submarine exists in a liminal state, not truly lost, but not recovered either. It's suspended between presence and absence. This cold case endures not because we're missing evidence, but because we're missing a clear meaning. The recovery attempt answered the question of whether such a feat was possible. It proved that the deepest abyss was not beyond human reach. But what it didn't resolve were the consequences of that reach. What responsibilities come with the power to retrieve the dead, the secrets of our adversaries, and the artifacts of a catastrophe? These are questions that remain just as relevant today, in an age where our technology continues to outpace our ethical consensus. The story of K-129, then, isn't just about a submarine or a daring secret operation. It's about how nations act when they think no one is watching. It's about the quiet decisions made far from public view, and about the things we take hand, the things we leave behind in the relentless pursuit of security. The ocean gave up a fragment of its secret once. The rest it has kept, pressing it into the crushing darkness, where it waits without judgment, beyond the reach of even our most ambitious machines.